Welcome to the ENDUROX Podcast with Dr. Dan Plews and Dr. Adam Storey, where high performance meets real-world application.
Adam Storey, how have you recovered from your deadly dozen at the weekend?
Honestly, mate, battling. And
Battling? You only did the relay.
I know. I was just going to say, it's a little bit embarrassing to say because it was three runs and 400-meter runs in 3 stations. But man, it's interesting like how much you can hurt yourself on such a short amount of exercise, eh?
Yeah. Do you want to explain to people what the deadly dozen is? Because I reckon many people who are listening to this might not even know what it entails. I guess it's quite hard to remember all the stations, so you don't have to say them in the exact order.
Yeah, no, thank goodness. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about it as if I'm an experienced veteran, but it was literally my first hit out on the weekend. Yeah, really, really great competition. Like it's, I believe it originated over in the UK, and you're looking at basically 12 400-meter runs around an athletics track. So that's always fun, getting outdoors. And much like HYROX, in between or interspersed with those runs, you've got 12 stations. Now, the main difference, I guess, from HYROX is HYROX, you've got some quite equipment-heavy stations, being the ergs, sleds and that kind of stuff, whereas Deadly Dozen, they really market it on the fact that it's really accessible. A lot of the stations are bodyweight-based exercises. So, say, for example, they've got your classic burpee broad jumps, but they've got things like bear crawl. All the other stations are using things like kettlebells, dumbbells, or a weight plate. Yeah, so for me, man, like as you mentioned, we did a mixed relay, team of 4 of us, 2 men, 2 women, which meant that we had to do each 3 runs in 3 stations, and you get to, much like again HYROX, pick and choose which stations you're gonna do. So for me, I actually had to start our relay. So I did a 400-meter effort and then went straight into the farmer's carry. So similar to HYROX, you got 24 kilo kettlebells for 200 meters. So this was 24 kilo kettlebells for 240 meters. And then tagged on to my partner. The next station that I had to do, again from memory, was the kettlebell goblet squats, which was an absolute quad destruction. So it's 60
It's surprisingly hard, the goblet squats. It's funny because when I've done a few singles. Actually, I have the world record for the 40 plus. Did you know that? For the deadlift dozen? Just so you know, if you're asking. But it made me realize that when it comes to wall balls, it's not my legs that are the problem, because I can do the goblet squats pretty easy. But push press, I am hopeless. The push press,
really?
I just get reamed in the push press. It's just ridiculous. Can't do it. My little spaghetti arms won't go for it. But it's a lot of reps though. 60 reps is a lot.
It is, yeah. So I'm probably the opposite to you, mate. Just due to my fibre type, I knew that I was going to get a full lactate flush and a full destruction on the quads, which I did on the goblet squat. So 60 reps.
Then you did clean and press, didn't you? Clean and press.
And then clean and press to finish with the 15 kilo plate. So again, 60 reps of that. And yeah, it was Oceania Champs, which was extra special for us. So we ended up not only winning our age category, we won overall. For the mixed relay.
Did you win the relay overall, did you?
Overall, man, yeah. So we were stoked.
I didn't know that. I thought you just won the age group.
No, won it overall. And yeah, again, the other amazing thing that we were stoked about is we set an age group world record for it. We actually broke it by 2 minutes and 47 seconds, broke the world record. So yeah, it was fun, man.
How hard did you send that first 400?
Yeah, again, I said to my son, Cully, I said, man, I've got to be smart about this because I can probably put myself into a pretty bad hole after 400 meters. So it wasn't too bad. I think I did it, what did I run it at? I think it was like 75 seconds, I think.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
70 seconds and then straight into the farmer's carry. But yeah, I just did not want to be stupid. When I did the relay at the Deadly Dozen, I did the singles in the morning, then I did the relay in the afternoon, and I got absolutely destroyed on that first 400 by some. Well, as we established last week, I can't run on my tongue, can I? So
So I was only dependent on my slow twitch fibers.
Yeah.
I couldn't pull out the one fast twitch. So
No,
but it was.
was
It's good though, eh? They're good events. They're great training races. Great training races.
I was going to say, mate, they're great training races. Like we had a lot of our HYROX crew there. Had one of our athletes, Alyssa Goodwin, who's charging ahead to Stockholm for HYROX World Champs. She was in our relay team as well. So again, it's a really great training crossover again, just again that sort of competition environment as well, which is fun.
So it was you, Alyssa, Heath, and Kez, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Also a couple of weapons. So I mean, it's a good team. It's an old no offense, everyone, older team, but it's a very good team. It's like you're all talking like all of like go getters and flag winners and everything like that. So that's cool. Yeah,
experienced team. That word you're looking for, Plews, not old. Experienced.
An experienced team. Well, actually, you're not experienced because you just said you've only ever done one. So, but you're talking like you are experienced.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But yeah, also at the weekend we had Hong Kong HYROX, which is good, and we had the man Dan Hoy 57:40.
Yeah,
which puts him not the third fastest time for a New Zealander, but the third fastest New Zealander. So I think behind Bo Wills and the big Dex man, which is a big step in the right direction. I started coaching Dan 12 weeks ago now. So, you're coming into, I think the training is starting to come through. And he was like a 101. So it's like a big 4-minute PB for him. And good stepping stone towards the world champs. And like, he's just scratching the surface. And yeah, I think he shocked a few people actually.
Yeah, well, it's very, very concerning and alarming in a good way when a person that does 57 minutes is only scratching the surface. So, do you want to give the viewers a bit of a background sort of story about Dan Hoy, where he's come from, and
yeah, I guess
what you see are his strengths and strengths are?
So Dan's from a triathlon background. Is very good as a junior and youth. I think he won the Youth Olympics. Actually, he won the Youth Olympics in triathlon. So he's very good, strong aerobic background. A lot of training, but fell out of love with triathlon and basically took up HYROX. And I started coaching him 12 weeks ago. He was just coaching himself and I said to him, because he came around to my house and we had a bit of a chat before I coached him just to see how things could work. And one of the things I said to him is like, tentative has no power. He was doing HYROX, but it was very tentative and he wasn't really giving it his all. So that was one. So, he just a little bit more focus and a little bit more programming made a big difference. And also I said to him, like, because we raced a couple of times and I'd beaten him twice and I went through all his numbers and I said to him, there's no way that I should be anywhere near what you can do. And I knew it at the time. Yeah. So I could see just from talking to him about what he's done in the past, some of his just his numbers in terms of what he can do in training. I was like, yeah, you should be nowhere near the times that you're doing. So I knew immediately that there was at least 4 or 5 minutes that's going to come off him quite quickly. But it really, we've kept things quite light. I don't think we've even tapped the surface with his running. I think he's close to a sub 8 minutes 3K in his heyday. So that'll, yeah, so that's pretty scary, right? And I mean, he's heavier now. That was when he was in, he's in the 80 kilos now. So obviously he was a pure runner then, but still it talks to how big his engine is. It's just a question of getting some of the stations right. But at the moment, we've taken in all the races that he's done, we've taken the approach of really holding back on the runs and using them as cruising to get through the stations. So once he gets better at the stations and he can start running a bit faster, I think he's still at the fastest run in the day, regardless. We've not, we're really just doing one hard run a week at the moment, and then a compromise run and a tempo run. Tempo running is something that HYROX athletes seem to not do, and it's such a big thing. And I look at it like triathlon. We do a lot of tempo running because it's a strength dominant. It's longer. It's very extensive endurance. It's running well when you're fatigued, and it's such a component that no HYROX athletes do, no HYROX athletes talk about. I had a meeting with Big Dexter Buchanan earlier in the week, and one of the things I was saying to him is I was trying to encourage him to include a bit more tempo running in his build up to Stockholm. And for those who don't know what tempo running is anything that basically sits between LT1 and LT2. So we classify it in the heavy exercise domain. So it can be basically it's around your half marathon pace to your marathon pace, in that sort of area. Most people never go there because they see it as level 3, but it's actually bread and butter of a lot of good run programs. And like for Ironman, I would almost exclusively do running in tempo and never do any threshold or VO2 max until I was just coming up closer to racing. So
wow, I've got so many questions here for you, Plews. Where do I start? Remind me to circle back to Dan. I've got some questions around him, but firstly, just for some viewers, like you've touched upon, like it is that zone 3, which people nowadays tend to like really, they've got this heightened awareness around zone 3 due to all the fact of polarized training coming out. So two-part question, my friend. Firstly, would you mind giving the listeners a bit of an example of a classic tempo session that you'd love to roll out, sorry. And the second part is just given the fact that it is in that zone 3, what are some considerations that you also have with athletes, following a tempo session or leading into a tempo session?
Yeah, I mean, so a typical tempo session is we do classify it as like extensive endurance. So it means it's like it's a little bit harder, but it's not. But therefore it's a little bit longer, because I talked about last week. There's no such thing as hard without intensity and duration. Like it's really it's hard to run 400 meters. It's hard to run 100 kilometers. It's all about the duration and the intensity together, even though they're very different. So because it's a little bit slower, you're going a little bit longer. And that means that typically you'd be accumulating, we talk about pure threshold, we're typically accumulating like 30 minutes of work at threshold when we're doing a training session. If we're getting up to 40, that's pretty big. That's a pretty big session. Like, it's pretty hefty. But with tempo, you can be 45 minutes to an hour, maybe more than an hour of tempo. So like a very typical, a longer session, I just gave this to one of my triathletes, for example, would be 3x5K. That's a big one. That's a big hearty one. And you just descend. So basically you start at your LT1. So like your marathon pace, and you go down, you do marathon pace, in between marathon and half marathon pace, then the last one will be at your half marathon pace, and that would be a real hearty one. 4x3K would be a typical one. But it's longer, right? So you're talking there's 12K, 15K, that sort of sessions. You can also do that based on time, right? You could do 4 by 10 minutes, or sorry, that'll be a bit short, but something like 4 by 15 minutes or something like that. Just a bit longer. So we're going towards more closer to 50 minutes to an hour.
Amazing.
Another really great session that I like to do is with the tempo is it can be with breaks, so it's a straight 10K where you go 1K, 2K, 3K, 4K, or you can go the opposite way around where you go 4, 3, 2, 1, but you basically start at your marathon pace and descend closer to your threshold. So you go 4K at marathon pace and you drop off 10 seconds per K, then drop off 10 seconds per K. I think I've done that with you before, haven't I?
Mate, you read my mind. I was just going to say, this was back when you and I were with Emirates Team New Zealand, and we did a morning training session it was Les Mills in the city, man. And it was, we did that exact treadmill session, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it absolutely destroyed me, mate. Yeah.
It's a great session. And it's actually, it can be done both ways, because at one way you're teaching yourself to run, like you can go run fast with fatigue because you've come from 4K, 3K, 2K, but you can also go 1K, start fast and then go to slower. Both work well, actually. So I still routinely include that session in all my build-ups. Actually, the 4, 3, 2, 1. It's a goodie. And then just going back to the heart rate considerations and overall load monitoring considerations, because again, like clocking up those zone 3 minutes can be relatively easy to do. So I guess from an athlete point of view, are there any key considerations that you'd be mindful of? Yeah, the one of the key considerations when it comes to before I talk about recovery, The main thing that we want to consider, though, is diversity within our training weeks as well. And I think that's one thing that we often lose sight of a little bit, is that when you look at a training plan, you don't want it to be too monotonous, and you want to be targeting different aspects of your physiology, right? So you want a bit of speed, maybe a few strides, you want a bit of threshold, and then you want a bit of tempo or VO2 max, or you could do 2 threshold sessions, however you want to be. But you do want diversity, and you want to move that around with the training program. So it's not like you just do tempo all the time and threshold all the time. You kind of I look at a program and look, okay, what's missing in the context of what the athlete needs, right? Where, and that's based on background individualization and all that kind of thing. But yeah, they can be, the trap you can fall into with tempo is that, you have to just make sure that your level 2 running is easier, I think, because otherwise because the tempo running can often sit quite close to the top of your L2 for a lot of it. You can be running quite fast. So, you want to make sure that if you are doing more tempo running, you want to have a bit of a gap between how fast you're running for your level 2 and how fast you're running for your level 3. But also you have to respect it like you would respect a threshold session, because it's of similar, I would say the load, if we measure it in terms of training load, it would actually come out to be quite similar because the duration is longer. So you respect the same type of recovery. Even though the autonomic nervous system stress may be slightly less, the muscular load will be the same, or could be even slightly longer depending on what happens. But, this is one of the things about all these contexts, because you can compare threshold to VO2 max to tempo, and you can make either of those sessions harder or easier. So we published a paper. Anna Holt was one of my master's students, and we published a paper that was that looked at the recovery between VO2 max versus threshold sessions and short interval training sessions. And just to talk about, I'm not going to talk about the short interval training sessions, but to compare VO2 max to threshold, the threshold training took way longer to recover from than the VO2 max training session. Way longer. And it was like substantially longer. And the reason it happened is because they maintained so much longer time at threshold and slightly above, whereas even for the VO2 max, yes, they were above it, but it wasn't for that long. But it was because of what the session was. So the VO2 max session was 6 by 3 minutes. The threshold session was 5 by 10 minutes. So you're talking quite an easy VO2 max session versus quite a hard threshold session. So you can't just say, oh, the juice isn't worth the squeeze when it comes to VO2 max training, because a 6 by 3 minute session is actually a decent VO2 max session. A 5 by 10 minute threshold session is a very hefty threshold session. So it's all about how you're balancing that when you're deciding where you're gonna put your week, and who the individual athlete is.
Yeah, I mean that's such a great soundbite and segue there, Plews. So I guess, what would be your recommendations? There's a lot of focus on threshold training and obviously zone 2 training within the HYROX space from coaches and athletes, but what would be your recommendations around sort of balancing the integration of VO2 max and into that training cycle? Keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I guess again, let's just identify what VO2 max and threshold training is. I think that's always a good starting point. I mean, in exercise physiology, we've done a lot of papers recently on measuring durability and things like this. And in exercise physiology, we demark training intensity distribution between moderate, heavy, and severe. So you have moderate, the transition between moderate and heavy, which is like that would be your LT1, so your aerobic threshold, which is closer to what you do in an Ironman, or closer to some people's marathon pacing, not if you're doing it under 2 hours, obviously. But, someone who's taking a normal amount of time would be closer to that. And then you're talking from the heavy to severe. And the heavy to severe threshold, where you go past those exercise intensity domains, is classified as threshold. And that's what people typically call as threshold intensity. And to differentiate those, so in the moderate intensity, if we were to measure lactate, for example, it wouldn't really rise. It would be very stable, and it would be at rest, it would be 2, 1, 1, 1.5. It might go to 2 or less than 2, and it just stay there. But you're still exercising, and you still have a reasonable breathing rate. When you go from moderate to heavy, what happens is now lactate will jump up, maybe to 3, 3.5, and it will also stay there, maybe gradually rise. When you go from heavy to severe, that demarcation there, that at that point you get another jump in lactate, but you have no steady state. So that threshold is what we call it it's like a quasi-metabolic steady state, right? So that's the point where you lose your quasi-steady state, because I say quasi because it's not fully steady state, because even below the threshold, you still get a bit of a rise in your VO2 over time, and you're rising your effort over time. But once you get past that threshold, you have no stability anymore, and you will just see lactates and your VO2 rise super quick. And that break point is what we call threshold training. So we're trying to get right on that break point of quasi-physiological steady state. We call it the maximal metabolic steady state in some of the research. There's loads of different terms for it, but that's what it is. And what's really interesting is that, there's a lot of talk around threshold versus VO2 max, and it's been debated for centuries, and it all goes back to polarized training. And we all talk about polarized training, and I think everyone agrees that polarized training is a good way to train. But the thing about polarized training is it explicitly does not include threshold training, because most of the studies, the Seiler, the Stöggl, they compare polarized training to threshold training. So they have the groups, they either do like more of a 80-20 split, where 80% of the training is at a low intensity and then 20% is at a VO2 max type intensity, or it's kind of more of a split, like 60-40, 50-50 threshold VO2 max. So, and in those studies, polarized training is always on top. So training more at your VO2 max is always better. It always seems to have better improvements in the individuals. But that's not to say that there's not therefore room, right? But now you can say, okay, but what happens if I do 80% of my training at a low intensity and 20% of my training at threshold? So that now you kind of like, there's a bit of push and a bit of pull, a bit of drag of how you take the program in terms of those factors, because it's not necessarily, no one's going to be doing 50-50 or even 60-40, which is kind of your pyramidal training intensity distribution, which is also seen to be effective. But it's how you balance the three. And at the end of the day, it's you're using a combination of all of those things to pull together a program that's demand driven.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. You've got so many different levers that you need to pull on. And I know last week we touched upon a paper which discussed, I guess, differences in fibre type, and how that can affect a person's recoverability, between sessions. Slow twitch dominant athletes, rapid recovery versus fast twitch. You're looking at a 5-hour kind of depression of neuromuscular function. So I guess with your prescription with regards to threshold and VO2, like what considerations are you bearing in mind, like when you're looking at different athletes?
Yeah, so typically what you do find is it's a lot dependent on background. Like, so someone like, if I just think I go back to Dan Hoy, because we were talking about him before, like I know for a fact that as soon as I give him VO2 max sessions, he's going to respond really quick, and he's going to get a big boost from doing that, because what's clear in the literature is that it's very stimulus dependent, right? And the more how can I say this? The stronger your training background, the bigger the stimulus to get the response. Like, and so you can either do more and more threshold volume, or you can increase the intensity. And there'll be a point where the threshold volume is going to stagnate and you can't push it anymore, because one is you're just going to be doing stupid amounts of threshold volume, which is going to increase your injury risk. And you're just going to go nowhere. So you have to add in some extra intensity to try and push the extra stimulus. And that's what's been very clear, in that very strong endurance background athletes will eventually have to introduce, and I would recommend they introduce a bit of VO2 max training in the lead up to a race. And even with the running economy data, you'll see huge improvements in people's running economy when they do more VO2 max training as well, because of the increases in efficiency when they go back to threshold.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, you often, your famous catchphrase, which you say time and time again, is that it didn't even touch the sides. I
Yeah.
assume when you say it didn't even touch the sides, you're referring about your training load, but who knows? That's open to question.
Open to debate.
Yeah, yeah. No, that is really fascinating to hear about, and especially like there'll be so many different listeners at the moment, you know, just trying to sort of understand like where can I best, you know, utilize VO2 training and versus threshold. So that was cool.
Yeah, but the thing is I think also is that like people shouldn't be scared of VO2 max training. Like that's what I want to bring across to the listeners, is that I think like a lot of coaches, they almost scaremonger people from doing VO2 max training because there's a big injury risk or a big like recovery risk, or you're not going to recover as fast. But like what I want to say is that you know Gordon Walker, he said to me is that, you know, his famous saying is a good session and a bad session look the same on paper, right?
Yep.
In that the session in itself, just because it says threshold or it says VO2 max, you cannot automatically assume that the threshold session is easier and takes less time to recover from than the VO2 max, because you can build a session in any way to make it harder or easier. And it's all about the stimulus and variety. So doing 6 by 3 minutes is a great stimulus for improvement. But sometimes it's like, sometimes you've got to push a stimulus and sometimes you've got to pull. And if you're finding yourself, you've done threshold and threshold and threshold, and that would be where I suggest people start, is start with threshold, move into threshold. So I would start with threshold and tempo, then move into maybe trying 2 thresholds a week, see how you cope with that, but keep it light. I would keep the total work of the threshold no more than 30 minutes, you know, keep it and when that starts to stagnate, the next thing you can do is you can start to kind of increase the total work in those threshold sessions, right?
Yeah.
And then when that stagnates, then you can look at improving the VO2 max. And that's why it comes back to that point before, is it's usually the athletes who have been training, have a longer training history, are going to probably benefit more from doing the VO2 max sessions.
Yeah, I mean those are cool recommendations, and I guess when we're talking about this kind of stuff, a lot of athletes will automatically be thinking about run-based sessions. But do you want to give us a breakdown in terms of what that would look like and how that would differ potentially being erg-based sessions and erg-based VO2? Like, are we looking to try and hit similar heart rates, or is there going to be a difference in like cardiac drift occurring on the ergs versus run sessions? So what would athletes need to be mindful of in those situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you should, obviously, training zones are different and those intensities are different for ski, row, and run. So you need to establish those. And at ENDUROX, right, we have that 5-minute test. So the 5-minute test is establishing a VO2 max effort, really. But from that, we're then we're almost reverse engineering it and establishing a threshold based on that. So, but the problem, I do think that, I mean, I guess it's a little bit of running, but I do like doing threshold sessions on the erg if the individual has the appropriate technique and can manage it. Because if you're someone with a really poor rowing technique and you're putting a lot of pressure on your lower back, same for the ski, you got to be a little bit careful. So I would, if you are going to do threshold sessions for HYROX, the way I do it is I use them as a complementary second session within a threshold day. So you might do your threshold session in the morning, and then if you're a little bit more advanced and you just want to accumulate a few more hours by taking off the mechanical load on the legs, you could do a shorter threshold set, which might just include 60 minutes of total work. So you're looking at half of what you did in the morning pretty much, but then you can use the ergs to do that. And I think that's a great way to do it. And typically you're looking at like about, I think it's approximately 7 to 10 seconds less than what you'd hold for a 2K is your threshold on a ski and a row. So you're holding that sort of pace. So for me, it's like, you know, I do a 138 for 5 minutes. So I'm looking at 148, 150s on the row is typically what I would hold for that threshold session. But I'd always do them second. And remember that as a second session, I think it's also important to remember that you've got to, when it is a second session, you've got to always think about that holy trinity of exercise intensity. So you got to look at your bit of heart rate, bit of feeling, and a bit of pace, because it becomes more important. Because if you're already fatigued for the first session, you do want to be thinking about, making sure that you've got that intensity in check. You don't want to be too hard.
Yeah. That's amazing. And just as we record this, it is mid-May, which means that we've got World Champs coming around the corner, so about 6 weeks away, which is very exciting. So I guess what's a bit of top of mind I've had different chats with a number of different athletes around sort of what the next 6 weeks is going to look like for them leading into Worlds. But I guess, a good chat in general would be about any competition, and this comes to mind, like one of my master's students, we're currently doing an injury surveillance study for HYROX. So, how does your training influence any injuries that you've received or unfortunately picked up in competition? So one of the questionnaire questions is around tapering. And initially my student got quite in depth in terms of the questions regarding the taper, but then it sort of really, caught me and made me realize that, hey, a lot of people out there that would be looking to answer this survey won't actually understand what their taper looks like or what it should look like, or maybe understand what these variables mean in the taper. So 6 weeks out from competition, Dr. Dan Plews, like what's some big rocks for you, man? Like, what are you looking to lift and shift and to sharpen that sword?
Yeah, well, as always, context before content, right? I think one of the first things that I look at is trajectory. So with any athlete, when you're looking at 6 weeks, is you want to look at the athlete's trajectory. And the worst thing you can do is think that so say you've got an athlete who's like on the up and they're just getting better and better and better. The worst thing you can do for that athlete is change too much and throw more load at them, because they're still obviously absorbing and improving from what's been done before. But if you've got quite a stagnant athlete and they're quite stable in the way they're improving, you could definitely do a bit more of an overload block. But the idea is that you want to finish that overload block within you've got basically from about 3 weeks now to do some substantial overload. And the research shows is that with Training Peaks, for example, many people will know what the program Training Peaks is, that we measure something called CTL, and CTL is basically the average training load, or the rolling training load over the last 52 days. I think it's 52 days. And you want to, and the best would be that you want that CTL value to peak around 3 weeks before competition. You do not want that value to be peaking at competition. If you do that, you get it wrong. So that gives you a little bit of a leeway from now until Worlds to do a big block now to try and peak that CTL value and get, which means doing hard training, volume training to try and peak that up. And then if you can do that, that's the best time. That's the best way that you're going to give yourself the best chance for the Worlds. But that's only if you're someone who's stagnated. Like for someone like Dan, for example, we are going to make very, very small tweaks because he's on a good trajectory at the moment. And the worst thing we can do is think, oh yeah, look at how well he's going now. Let's do even more training. Clearly that's not going to be the way to do things. It's about keeping things as status quo. But for many people, it's a good period to do a bit of an overload for the next 3 weeks, basically, before you bring it down and start tapering.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess I've had a similar conversation on my next question around this with one of my athletes, but also this has sprung to mind going back to my master's students' injury surveillance study, because as part of that online questionnaire, we're asking how many times have you competed prior to your pinnacle event that we're really focusing on. So I guess based on where you are in the world, like some people have really the opportunity to compete multiple times, like in a build up to a competition. So what's your kind of take on that, man? Like in terms of like, is there too much in terms of competition load? Can you compete too much, or is there benefit in competing quite frequently?
Yeah, I think it's like depends on the athlete. And I've had this conversation before, and I get asked this question a lot in triathlon as well, but it's dependent on a couple of factors. The main factor is recoverability. So if you have an athlete who can do a HYROX race and do it well, and they can recover fast from it, then there's an athlete who can probably race a little bit more, because and it comes back to that CTL value, and you can see it with an athlete who competes too much. Because if you have an athlete who's competing too much, what you typically see is that CTL value, so that chronic training load number, so how much quality training they're doing over that 50-day period. If they're competing too much, it will gradually just drop. Because what happens is they recover into competition. They do the competition, which is a stimulus, but probably not enough of a stimulus to elicit a big response. They get tired. They have to not train. They recover. And it takes them too long to recover before they get back to the training. They do another race. So they then they do like a week of training. Another race is around the corner. They taper. They recover. A little bit of training. So then you kind of on this perpetuating like downward spiral. But on the other hand, if you're an athlete who doesn't need a long taper, they can recover in 2 days. So they just like freshen up really quick. They recover in a day. Those athletes can get away with it more. But if you're talking about the highly aerobically experienced, well-trained athletes can race more and get away with it, rather than if you're someone new, you probably don't want to be doing as much. But you want to be practicing your transitions and your race-specific simulation sort of thing more as well as if you're not doing as much racing.
Yeah, it's a massively fine line. I mean, I believe like some of the best training is actually competing myself, and I guess I do preface it with athletes that, you cannot expect to PB at every single competition into a build-up, but, treat, this particular competition as maybe a run-focused comp or a station-focused comp, because as much as people love doing sims, you're never, ever, ever going to replicate that same kind of anticipatory heart rate rise that you're getting waiting for that start line or on that start line. So that kind of stuff, even learning to manage your competition nerves in the warm-up phase, that's a great form of training as well. So I am a big advocate of competing when the opportunity arises, but granted that, you're not going to taper for every single event, you're not going to PB on every single event, but there will be something that you can gain from that. Even working on your pre-morning routine rituals leading into the competition, that kind of stuff is also consideration.
And that's the benefit of working with a good coach, right? Is that I think if you can manage how you enter the competition with specific goals, and you're not just going to do it as hard as you possibly can, I think that's really good. But like in Australasia, we're not really at the privileged position where we can race a lot, really. So it's a moot point, really, because the races are so far between. But I think in Europe, anyone who's listening in Europe, it's quite easy to race every weekend, right? And sometimes 3 or 4 times over a weekend. When I did Melbourne and I raced 4 times, how many times did I race? No, I raced 3 times in Melbourne. It took me a long time to recover from that, like a lot. And some, like, your Charlie Bottrells of the world, he races all the time, like multiple times over the weekend. And, but he's a very upper end elite, and he can strong endurance background as well. So he can cope with it. But I think it's, it is a fine line. And most of the time, my answer to many of the athletes in ENDUROX who ask us about racing, is I always encourage them to do it, because generally it's hard to do. It is hard to do too many, especially in Australia and New Zealand, right? So,
yeah, I agree. What else is on the mind of the Plews, mate, at the moment?
Well, I think we should talk a little bit about tapering, though, as we talked about as we were in the mix of tapering. What makes a good taper, I guess. I'm interested to know, how do you taper for strength? If you're doing a big lift,
HYROX
if you're
specific?
in a strength training competition, how does that look like? Is it similar?
Yeah.
No, for a weightlifting competition.
Yeah, weightlifting competition. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, eh? Like, it's weightlifting, that's quite a cool example, actually. So 2 different quite distinct philosophies, like East German, all about volume, versus Bulgarian. I'll use it as an example. East German, the Bulgarian method, as mentioned, all about volume. So you can kind of think of it, that would be like your tempo stuff, big on tempo, but you'd never get close really to race pace work if you use it as a HYROX analogy. So that kind of structure kind of put a lot of faith that all these reps, all this volume is going to magically enable you to peak perfectly on the day of competition. So I think that can be quite a hit and miss approach, because it requires quite a big strong mental fortitude and
I
to be able
don't know
to do
how
that.
you could do that. But I couldn't
No.
imagine like entering. I mean, I couldn't even do it for running. If I'd done a running race and I knew that I'd just been running at like and I was expected to do my HYROX at 3:30 minutes per K, and I'd only been running at
Yeah.
4:30s.
Crazy, eh? It's
I don't
crazy.
think my mind could do it. And
No,
it's even more crazy for weightlifting because it's so you either do it or there's no like run a bit slower. It's either you do it or you don't.
Yeah. You're not going to muscle through a snatch. So I guess
Yeah.
that was a bit of a very broad and brutish kind of description, but it is pretty much like that. You may have like the odd max out session leading into that, but it's few and far between. Versus the Bulgarian style is all about intensity. So almost always working at race pace, if you use that HYROX analogy. So again, you're feeling the intensity, you're feeling that weight. Downside is all that intensity comes at a huge cost, both metabolically but also cognitively. But it does give you the confidence going into competition that you are, you've got that mindset to approach that bar, handle those nerves and everything. So quite two distinct. My weightlifting philosophy was finding the sort of middle ground between both.
Yeah.
I definitely did a lot more on the intensity side. So because I really appreciated the fact, and sort of going back to my commentary around competing as the best form of training and to a certain degree, mainly around enabling athletes to sort of control their inner self-talk and control how they prepare for competitions. So we used to literally run sort of simulated weightlifting competitions, sort of 3 or 4 weeks out from a major event. Again, so you're getting the athletes preparing, feeling what it's like walking up to the bar. But again, like the intensity is really cranking. We'd even sort of push for personal bests, and sometimes we'd get national records broken in training, 2-3 weeks out. And sometimes on paper you're thinking, well, geez, this is looking good. But in some instances, the athlete maybe had peaked a little bit too early, or maybe their nerves got the better of them on competition days. So again, it's pretty classic in terms of just rising up that intensity, dropping the volume down. But what was really interesting as part of my PhD, I looked at the gene expression changes in weightlifters over different training phases. And it was really cool to see that in some of my weightlifters, based on their genomic responses, they were definitely more suited to maintaining higher volumes leading into competition, versus other athletes were more suited to dropping the volume dramatically, but their intensity, they were better off holding intensity.
So what was some of the what were you measuring though to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it was looking at sort of I guess we looked at changes in their performance, like their competition performance. We're monitoring changes in their training volume and intensity and how that married up to their changes in competition performance, but also the gene expression changes on top of that. So genes that were involved with sort of protein turnover, muscle repair, regeneration, that were having positive effects. They were significantly upregulated in response to a good taper, versus they were being a little bit blunted in what was termed like a taper that wasn't probably suited for them. And I guess generally speaking, what we found is it was a bit of a sex-related difference as well. Females tended to respond better with a higher amount of volume leading into competition, versus males. Again, it's you sort of cut that volume. It doesn't really matter as long as the intensity is held high. So I guess one type of
so the females responded better to cutting the volume but keeping the intensity high.
Other way around.
The males, so that's typical tapering though. Reduce volume, keeping the intensity. But the females, you kept the volume high.
Had to keep a little bit of volume in there up to competition. And I guess
the intensity stayed the same. So it was just basically you're talking a 50%. So say a typical taper, you reduce the overall training load by 50%, but you keep the intensity distribution the same. So with males, you might reduce it by 50%, keep the intensity there. With the females, you might reduce it by 75%, but you'd keep the same intensity distribution as well. It was just like, but were they doing less training generally, or was it this, like overall?
In terms of frequency?
In terms of overall volume?
Yes, they were. They were leading. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
But like in general, in even an overload period, was their training less than a male's?
Oh, the males. Yes, it was obviously on absolute numbers, but relatively it was pretty comparable. So the main differences, and this is due to the fact that the level of the cohort, they were all sort of 10 years plus at the international level. They were very, very experienced lifters. They could handle that type of volume, both male and female. But yeah, it was just interesting that the females having to hold that volume a little bit higher, and hypothetically, or one thing that we talked about was potentially the need to sort of keep the testosterone levels elevated a little bit more in the females.
Yeah, interesting.
Because again, like obviously females do have naturally circulating testosterone levels, and you drop that away, and potentially they're seeing a decrease further in their natural levels. So,
I mean, the individualization of, I think that's what it comes down to with that. We're circling back to the VO2 max and the threshold, though, is that there's a massive genetic component to the way people respond to training, and this huge individual variation. I actually was just writing a blog article that I will put on ENDUROX that was like comparing threshold and VO2 max, because when I knew we were going to be talking a bit about this I started looking into it. I'm going to read this one part of it. I'll read it verbatim because it's quite interesting. It says it's from a study called the Heritage Family Study. Remains the most rigorous investigation of individual variation in VO2 max response to standardized training. In 481 sedentary adult participants competing in a 21-week program, aerobic training, mean VO2 max gain was approximately 400 milliliters per minute. The range stretched from near zero in low responders to over 1,000 milliliters per minute in high responders. Heterability of VO2 max trainability was estimated up at 47%, with familial aggregation data suggesting that approximately 2.5 times more variance in the training response existed between families than within them. 2.5 times. Isn't that crazy? So, like,
that's crazy.
Basically, if you have, if you know that you've got between families, like your brothers, and you'll respond. If you know that you've got a dad or a brother who responds well to a training stimulus, you could probably apply it to a younger sibling, and you've got a high chance that it's going to work.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So
just the natural breeding programs in place, eh?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the genetic factors are huge to the way you respond to training, and also in that paper, it was another paper that came out, and it was non-responders to a low dose of 60 minutes frequently became responders when the dose was increased from 60 minutes to 240 minutes per week at the same intensity. So they had this one study that just basically found all these non-responders to training at 60 minutes per week, gave them more training, and they were suddenly responders. So it's all about the dose is the medicine, right? Comes back to
yeah.
And that's my same point that comes back before, is that when you talk about VO2 max training, you probably need a higher dose as people are getting faster or improving or have a stronger aerobic engine. But to finish it off on the taper things for HYROX, I think what you talked about in the strength, the same principles apply, right? Definitely. Because a typical taper is 7 to 14 days. I think 10 is the sweet spot. That's typical how I'll go for, is a 10-day taper. And we're always looking to reduce volume, but keep the intensity the same. So we typically reduce the volume by about 50% of what you're normally doing. So say in a normal week, you're doing 8 by 4 minutes as your threshold set. In a taper week, you'll be doing 4 by 4 minutes, but you keep the intensity identical. If you're doing your normal long run in a normal week is 75 minutes, you're basically halving that and doing the same. So you're keeping the intensity, reducing the overall volume, and ideally maintaining the frequency. So if you're doing 3 sessions a day on a Monday, try and keep 3 sessions a day on a Monday. And it doesn't really matter if it's a linear taper, a stepwise taper. There's no real evidence to suggest that any of them are any better than the other. But, I prefer to do kind of a linear taper that, I do a little bit less as I come towards the racing. And that's what I'll program for most of my athletes. So the day before, then, you don't want to be, there are acute responses to training. So if your race is on a Saturday, you don't want to be doing like your 4 by 4 minutes the day before. You want to keep that pretty light, but it's quite, those are the general rules you can apply.
Yeah. I agree. And I think for coaches out there, it's such a critical conversation to have with the athletes, like to firstly explain what the taper will look like for them, but also getting their input into that taper as well, because, what do you reckon will feel good for you leading into that competition? Because you cannot have, case in point, going back to that weightlifting example, you cannot have a cookie cutter approach taper for every single athlete and expect it to work,
Yeah. I mean, some people like to do, I was typically someone who did a lot more training in my taper. When I was talking about my triathlon days, I like to train quite a lot. And one of the reasons I like to do that is because I found it grounded me, and I'll get quite nervous before racing. And I found that, you almost have a bit of self-doubt that creeps in when you train less. And I found that doing a bit more training would always build my confidence, because it's like, I still am, you go out and do a session and then you feel good, you still feel in shape. And I think there is a psychological component, and athletes who are used to training a lot find it hard to not train. I was never very comfortable with almost doing nothing. But I have some athletes who almost do zero. Like, they'll do you're talking like 50%. They'll do less than 50%. You're talking 10, 15%, and they thrive off it. They enjoy not doing any training. So it's dependent on the psychology of the athlete. And for those who are listening, I actually wrote a blog that is available on the ENDUROX website that is all about this topic of what to do in these final 6 weeks in the lead into Stockholm. Obviously, you don't have to be racing in Stockholm. It can be any race where you've got 6 weeks to go. But one of the conclusions that I made in that article was that, yes, what you're doing now is having a big impact. So we talked about increasing that chronic training load and trying to get it peaking 3 weeks before competition. But that is the biggest effect, is what you're going to be doing the taper. The taper has a huge effect on your overall performance. So I think there's like a 10, 15% increase in your performance from when you're in the overload state to your tapered state. It's not like the taper's having an effect if you're fresh going doing a taper, but if you're very overloaded and you do a taper, you have a massive increase, and that increase is bigger than the fact that you're at a high CTL in 3 weeks out. So it's definitely something that you really want to dial in and get right.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, you just going back to that heritage study, you're talking about the genetics that underlie VO2 and training dose responses. But is there any genetics that are predisposing us to better recovery from an endurance perspective?
Well, don't you think it comes back to what we talked about last week with those wing gaits? And I think the main thing that's affecting recovery mainly is muscle fiber composition and the genetic components associated with that. So I'm sure there's another paper that looked at the recovery and overload training generally between fast twitch dominant and slow twitch dominant fibers. And slow twitch dominant athletes can cope with more training load generally because they recover faster. So I think the most of the genetic components is coming from that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I agree. I guess from that strength and power perspective, like as mentioned with my thesis, I did see differences in, I guess, the protein synthesis pathways. So there is a bit of a genetic component, and again, I liken that weightlifting cohort to almost like Wolverine. The famous X-Men they get destroyed and annihilated and come back and just keep regenerating. So, I guess with that stuff there as well, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Is like we don't know if these lifters or these athletes were born with this predisposition, or if it's a case of epigenetics where over time, just due to that continuous stimulus, that they're getting those changes in the genomic expression, which are now going to be advantageous to their performance. So,
and also we do know that over time, like lots of endurance training, you can shift some of your muscle fiber types, right? So you can shift some fast twitch to slow twitch, and therefore you're going to be coming more towards a slow twitch side. So over time, your ability to hold and do more training is going to increase, right? Because you are actually having shifts in the muscle fibers as well.
Yeah. Amazing.
Amazing. All right, dude. So, what are you up to next?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's honestly, for me, I've just got my sights set on HYROX World Champs coming up. So I'll be heading over there with the Sports Science Advisory Council. We're looking to come together almost like the Avengers and sort of have a chat around sort of what research projects we've got currently on, but also what research projects we'd like to do coming up. but we're also going to be spending a bit of time with the Elite 15 coaches over there as well, just having a chat around what kind of support they may need leading into various competitions with their athletes. So yeah, just looking forward to that, really. What about yourself?
That's going to be cool. That's going to be cool. I'm off to Kona on Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
I'm doing a bit of a training camp with some triathletes there, so that shall be good. But yeah, I forgot you were going to Stockholm as well. You got to give because obviously I'm not going now. We'll get. I had a question about that from one of the ENDUROX athletes in the webinar. Actually, it was if we were going to do anything, and I totally forgot you were there. So now he can meet the legendary Adam Story, the one and only.
Thanks for forgetting about me. It's all right. Tell us more about Kona, mate. That's going to be exciting.
Yeah, well, it's kind of half family, half holiday. So half work, half holiday. So we've got one of my one-on-one triathletes, and we're doing a bit of a camp there, training for Kona. But the families are coming too, so it's kind of a bit of both. But it's going to be a nice break. It's going to be good.
Amazing.
Yeah. All right, dude. Well, everyone, do check out ENDUROX 7 days for free as well. Do check out the training programs if you liked anything you hear today. Let us know, and we'll probably do some Q&As, shouldn't we? That would be good one day.
We should.
We should open the floor to some Q&A. So I think the next one we're going to try and get on a guest, and I'm thinking the one and only Sam Purchase. What do you reckon?
Perfect.
Yeah, I reckon that'd be good. Yeah,
we can afford
talk force velocity profiles. You're the guru. We'll have him on as like the man behind the guru.
Yeah, there's no conflict of interest there. Me being a supervisor, that's all right.
No, he'll be quivering with you being there, making sure he says the right thing. You know it, Sam. All right, mate. Yeah. We'll catch you soon.
Perfect. All right, Dave. Catch you, man.